All right, hello everybody. Welcome to our next lesson here as we continue to kind of wrap up our unit on the Progressive Era. So today we're going to look at the struggle for equality. So our objectives and standards to understand political organizations formed by African Americans to promote civil rights and to analyze actions taken by minority groups to improve rights. And take a look at the standards there, please. And our desired result. How did African Americans and other minority groups work for equal rights? So problems in the Progressive Era. While the Progressive Era did help improve the lives of many people, minorities are going to continue to struggle. For example, African Americans, Latinos, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants all face problems still. Now, there were efforts by progressives, such as through the Americanization movement, that attempted to change how certain people live their lives. Sometimes they did follow these rules, sometimes they didn't. And there are also many progressives who also had racist views. In some instances, progressives used misguided views to keep African Americans in a lower social status. A popular view of the time was that African Americans may not have been as intelligent as whites, and things like that, so many people followed that view even though it was wrong. The Supreme Court decision in Plessy v. Ferguson also upheld Jim Crow laws with its separate but equal doctrine. Long story short, a man who was 1/8 African American, Homer Plessy, decided to sit in a white section of a railroad car when they asked him to move because he was African American. He refused. He took his case to the Supreme Court, saying that it was racist and segregation and everything like that. But the Supreme Court ruled that as long as states and legislators and facilities offer the same type of services to, or facilities to, African Americans as whites, it was legal. In many cases, these facilities were not equal to white facilities, but that's how the law and many people were allowed to get away with it at the time. So, striving for equal rights. Despite these injustices, the most prominent African American leader of the time, Booker T. Washington, his picture is right here for you, he's going to urge patience. He told African Americans to move slowly towards racial equality, and he believed that if they worked hard and were patient, whites would grant African Americans equal rights. Now, there were others, such as W.B. Du Bois, right here, and William Monroe Trotter, right there, who rejected this idea. Du Bois and Trotter actually urged African Americans to demand equal rights immediately. So, forming civil rights organizations. Concerned that African American men across the South were being denied the right to vote, Du Bois and Trotter met with other African American leaders in the summer of 1905, and they met at Niagara Falls in Canada, since they weren't allowed to stay at a hotel in the United States near Niagara Falls, so they had to go to Canada to do so. The group called themselves the Niagara Movement, and they basically rejected this idea by Booker T. Washington and some others that African Americans would be granted civil rights eventually over time. They also called for African Americans to learn more than trade skills. Booker T. Washington said that African Americans should learn basic trade skills and get a job, while Du Bois and Trotter and others believed that African Americans should learn history and literature and philosophy. That way they could educate themselves and learn for themselves and help themselves progress. Now, unfortunately, the Niagara movement never really gained enough strength to make a powerful impact, but we'll see these gentlemen and others kind of come back in a little bit here. So in the summer of 1908, the residents of Springfield, Illinois attacked and killed 2 African Americans and burned a bunch of homes after attempting to lynch 2 African American prisoners in the city jail. Now, members of the Niagara movement and others were shocked that such a thing happened in Abraham Lincoln's hometown. The attacks also caught the attention of white reformers. Now, several white reformers joined with the Niagara movement to form the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, in 1909. Now, its goals as a political organization were to help African Americans gain political, economic, and social equality. Now, many reformers that joined the movement were people such as Jane Addams, her picture's right here, Ray Stannard Baker, Florence Kelley, and also Ida B. Wells, who owned her own newspaper and actually wrote about lynchings to draw attention to the issue. Now, what the NAACP did is it would bring lawsuits to court to try to change unfair practices against African Americans, especially against African Americans in housing and them getting careers. So, expanding economic opportunities. African Americans across the country are moving from rural areas or from the countryside to urban centers like big cities. So churches and clubs of African Americans set up employment agencies and relief organizations to help African Americans settle into their locations. And in 1911, more than 100 of these groups and cities joined together to form what is called the Urban League. Now, the Urban League was organized to help poor African Americans, while the NAACP focused more on middle-class African Americans. For poor African Americans, the Urban League helped families buy books for school children, gave them supplies and clothes, and they also helped people find jobs. Now, presently, both organizations still exist today and still help African Americans today. This one here, this is the symbol for the Urban League, and then this one here is the symbol for the NAACP. So, like I said on the last slide, they're both around today, and they still do a lot of work to support African Americans and others in equality and things like that. All right, so our closure. How did African Americans and other minority groups work for equal rights? Think about the Niagara movement, the views of different reformers, the NAACP, the Urban League, all those things, and how they tried to help people gain equality. All right, hope you have a great rest of your day or night, and I hope to talk to you soon.